This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we're getting a little bit pretentious and extolling our love for D&D and tabletop role-playing games and the sorts of stories we love to tell using them. All that and more coming up right now. Hello everybody and welcome to the Eldritch Lorecast, your favourite tabletop RPG podcast. My name is Ben Byrne, and with a panel like this, why wouldn't it be your favourite tabletop role-playing game podcast? I'm here with James Hake, Sean Merwin, Dael Kingsmill. Dael, where was the first place you were introduced to tabletop role-playing games of D&D? Was it in a game store? Were you with friends at a house?
I believe it was downstairs in my house with my brother. My brother introduced me to RPGs in a room that we call the casino because it has downlights and a bar.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Learn to play D&D in a casino. That's what you can tell people from now on.
That's what I can tell people.
Yeah, great. James Hake, what about you? First place you were introduced to the wonderful world of role-playing games?
My living room with a game that someone who'd played D&D a couple of times had made up with the soundtrack to Super Smash Bros. Brawl playing in the background.
I'm curious to know, was that third edition? Was that your introduction into the game?
Yeah, my timeline's a little bit funky because I met my first D&D group in high school. They all owned 3.5 books. It was around the time 4th edition began. But
Right.
for years and years, we played 3.5.
Yeah, right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Which is so funny to say because I love 4th edition D&D, right? We weren't playing out of this weird sort of like, oh, it's not real D&D. It's the only game we owned because we were broken in high school.
4th edition does have this weird, like I came in at 5th, so 4th edition has this weird reputation for me. I was aware of when 4th launched though, just being on the internet and hearing about all the disgruntledness. Sean Merwin, where was the first place you learned to play role-playing games?
Back in the 18th century, well, no, not quite that far. It was surprisingly close to where Dael learned. It was the cellar of a friend where there was a bar and a pool table and playing first edition AD&D as a very, very wee lad.
I like that between both you and Dael, the stereotype of D&D happening in the basement is kind of holding up.
It's true.
A little bit of a confession this week. We are recording this in the past, and you are listening to this in our future. So we don't have any news this week because we don't know what is going. We can't see into the future. We can only exist here in this.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah.
I know what's coming, and it's very exciting.
All right, Dael, the top news story for this week. Go.
Well, I mean, it has to be when the squid ate the moon. Right out of the sky.
Yeah, what a terrible day that was. It was no fun going to the beach anymore. There were no waves.
The day the squid came.
These Squid Games have gotten out of hand.
So I guess the only news apart from squid moon death is the fact that this is the 5th episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. And in this episode, we thought we would just, now that we've been here a while, get to know each other a little bit better. By each other, I don't just mean the host, but I mean you and us, audience, you and us, dear listener. Grab a chair, snuggle in, get close, because we are going to be delving back into the origins of tabletop role-playing games, not in general, more our experiences with tabletop role-playing games, and talking about why. Why play tabletop role-playing games? Why we personally play them? Why you should play them if you don't? Should we be so fortunate, so privileged for this, for our humble podcast to be your first introduction into role-playing games? This is why we play them. Sean Merwin, back in that basement, which is not the word you used, my word, basement. What did you call it?
A cellar.
There you go. Yeah. See, there, it's an Australian American thing. I don't think we have cellars here unless it's to hold wine. What brought you there? But I guess more importantly, what keeps you there? Why do you play tabletop role-playing games?
What brought me there was the cool kids. My best friend's brother was older, and his friends were down in the basement playing this game, but we weren't allowed to go down there because we were 4 years younger and we weren't cool. but they were having a blast, it seemed. But then it turned out that a couple of the players that they were expecting didn't show up. So they needed warm bodies to play these characters. So we were dragged down there, and just the game itself was obviously brilliant and captured the imagination, but being there with these older kids and being able to be cool like them was part of the draw. But that lost its luster quickly, being with these bullies. But the game really captured my imagination. And I had always loved games, and I had always loved stories, but there was no media back then that really combined the two well.
Sure.
Our video games were pixels on a screen that bounced back and forth, or maybe Space Invaders shooting up. But that was it. That was our video game selection at the time. So we didn't have a way to play a game that would also tell a story the way that this game with dice and character sheets did. And it hit both my loves directly in the bullseye. And so I just couldn't wait. And of course, we weren't invited back because the two players that were missing had come back, but they had just graduated from basic D&D into advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So they were tossing out their basic games, and I latched onto one and took it home and read it and tried to teach myself how to play this strange game, which is very hard to do when you're 10 years old and don't have a big vocabulary and don't understand all these strange things, but it still was amazing. And so over time, I found more people to play with, people who did understand the game better, had been taught the game well, and just couldn't get enough of it from that point forward, and knew at that point that this is what I want to do with my life.
Was it similar for you, James, when you first entered? Were you a similar age?
I was a freshman in high school, so I was like 14 years old. And I feel like the circumstances of my introduction were wildly different because video games in particular had evolved so much, right? I was always a book nerd. I was always a fantasy nerd. Love The Hobbit, love Harry Potter, love Star Wars. But by that time, there had been a lot of video games that I think had quite deftly interwoven narrative and gameplay. And yet, I wasn't playing a lot of Final Fantasy or anything like that. I wasn't playing actual, or Baldur's Gate even. I wasn't playing any sort of role-playing game RPGs. I was playing things like The Legend of Zelda and RuneScape and things like that had this sort of fantasy flavor to them, but didn't actually... they had kind of a veneer of storytelling, but they never kind of punched into the meat of it. And so when I found D&D, I was like... I had a similar experience still to you, Sean, where it's like, oh, I've loved this so much, but I actually get to go as deep as I really, really want to now. It's like everything before has just been surface level. Now I can actually do this.
Yeah, for sure. I find, like, I didn't come into role-playing games specifically until I was already a man, as Bane would say. But, video games and tabletop war games were my introduction into that sort of storytelling space. And I find that even when I'm playing a game that doesn't have a lot of story, like I remember playing, I think it was Star Wars Battlefront 2, had this really cool mode, the original one, not the more recent one, had this really cool mode that was called like Planetary Invasion, where you would build a fleet and you'd fly it to different planets, and then you'd choose whether you were rebels or Imperial or Republic or droid army, separatists. And if their fleet was in the same space as your fleet, then you'd have a space battle, and then you'd do a ground war, or you'd just do a ground war. All of this is a
Galactic Conquest.
Right,
yes,
there you go.
That was the voice they did every time, yeah.
So I would find that between the rounds of combat, I was literally in my head role-playing like Yoda and Obi-Wan and whoever, creating this story beyond what the game was delivering to me. And so have always been sort of, I turned every game into a role-playing game. I turned Rocket League into a role-playing game in my head where I was like, I'm the best damn Rocket League race car driver ever. And I'm just playing against the AI. I'm not even playing against other people. And then, I get in a crash and I'm injured and I'm like, oh no, but it's okay. This other guy's going to drive my car for me. There's no story in Rocket League, but I made one. Dael, are you similar? Do you do that with, do you just turn everything into a role-playing game?
I don't know whether I turn everything into a role-playing game. I suppose I come at it from a weird angle. So I was introduced to RPGs by my brother, I mentioned, but it was the stories he would tell. He was playing Rogue Trader, the Warhammer sort of tabletop RPG, and I didn't understand any of it. I didn't understand any of it because he was talking about Warhammer and this game system. I had no idea what was going on, but I was like, he's a space pirate and he rolled a 1, so he fell down the ramp. Like it was those bits. I was like, this is funny. There's something here. It's this story he was telling. So I suppose it was story first. And then cut to many, many, many years later that I was looking at sort of Pathfinder and the Iron Kingdoms. And it was the homebrew that really, I think, dragged me in, because I'm looking at these and I'm going, why does this dwarf get a -2 to charisma? I think that's wrong. I'm going to change it. And I got my hands on a copy of the Pathfinder core book, and it's got notes scribbled throughout it where I'm just like, I don't like this floating modifier. I'm never going to remember it. I'll change it. And that's kind of slowly what pulled me in as I was like, realizing that yeah, it's a game that has all this power to tell a story, but I also have the power to change the game and change the story that it tells. I think that's kind of what started dragging me in. And then a throwaway reference during the olden days when I was on Geek and Sundry Vlogs, we had a vlogger hangout when we first hit 50,000 subscribers, and someone just threw away a reference. They said, we should do a game of D&D sometime with all the vloggers. And I was like, interesting. Interesting. And then it never came up again, but I was the one who held onto it in my heart. And I was like, wait, I need to learn to play this game, and I need to teach it to my friends because my friends will like it. And then Critical Role started, and that was a huge boon because I could just show my friends. I was like, look at this, look how fun it is. And they went, okay, that does sound fun. But I think it was sort of a strange, meandering, long-term path, because I ultimately only really first played a tabletop RPG in my 20s.
Yeah, I was basically the same. And I feel the same in terms of it being a meandering path, because like I said, it was tabletop war games were my first introduction into real kind of tabletop gaming. And even those, I was more interested in the story of the battle than the sport of defeating your opponent necessarily. And then when I got into my 20s, it was Critical Role as well. It was kind of like I had a group of friends that had played D&D and they wanted to get me into it, but it was Critical Role that kind of gave me that nudge off the cliff when I watched a few episodes, and I was like, this is amazing. This is like, as Dael, I believe you did, and James, you've said a few times you have, I went to drama school and learned performing arts and learned the art of expression through performance. And I was like, that's what this is. This is just the opportunity to express oneself at the table through the safety of, playing a fictional character. I was like, why didn't I find this when I was younger? Dael, am I correct in that? Did you go to performing arts?
I did. I went to actually a performing arts high school and then also studied it. I have a degree in theatre. Yeah. James has a degree in theatre, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Does that influence either of your approaches to the game?
Oh, I'm sure it influences everything I do every day.
Yes, it's subtle. I wouldn't say I ever go out into the world and I'm like, oh, I will use my BA in theater studies today, and they will know that I played Hamlet. But no, I mean, it's a fabric. It's part of the tapestry of my unique existence as a human being. It's a spice that I carry with me.
Sean, when you because you've been designing games now for quite a while, what led into that for you? Were you running games before leading into that? And I suppose, obviously you've had a professional career for a while now designing games, but like besides the career aspect of it, like what is it that drives you to want to tell stories within that medium?
I think our human brains are just wired to tell and hear stories. I don't care who you are, you want to express yourself in some way, and it can come in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be artistic. It can just be you wanting to come home from work and tell someone how your day went because you want to be seen and you want to be heard and you want that experience to be shared with others. And and role-playing games are a medium to do that. There really are an artistic medium, and they weren't treated as such for so long until we have and had the technology to do that. And now we're seeing it everywhere, as we've discussed Critical Role many times. And people are gravitating toward this as a new medium of artistic expression and of just entertainment. And, you know, my whole life, like I said, when I started playing D&D and other role-playing games, I thought this is what I want to do. But there was no way to get into the industry back then. There was basically one company you could work for, that was TSR, and there might have been 5 jobs. There was no DM's Guild or One Bookshelf or any other way, no license to use the game. So I thought, well, I'll go into teaching because teaching's fun, and I like teaching. But really what I was doing the whole time was just preparing myself for the day that I could do this. And it wasn't something I thought about. It was just something that happened. So I got a degree in history and I got a degree in English, and then I got a creative writing master's. And with no plan to work on role-playing games at all until 3rd edition came out. And then I thought I'd get back into playing. I now have a daughter, so she's going to want to learn to play at some point. So let's get back into this new 3rd edition. And through various circumstances and happenstance and luck and lots of work for very little pay, I ended up doing it. And I've enjoyed every second of it since then, all 20 plus years of it.
I was going to say, I love that you sort of appeal to this human drive of creativity that expresses itself in the game, because I wrote a very pretentious foreword to a supplement that I published on the DM's Guild at some point that was about...
Sorry, could I just say, we're talking about why we love this game. Pretension is fully invited into this conversation. Get as pretentious as you like. Because gods know I will in a moment.
Because I am pretension itself. I'm happy to be invited. No, I wrote this thing basically talking about how humans were born to tell stories. And I related it to mythology. So there's this kind of theory out there. I don't know whether it's true or not, but there is an anthropological theory that humanity kind of began with the first spark of fire, with controlled fire, because that's the point when we swapped from just being, hunters, foragers to people who told stories. Because suddenly it extended daylight hours. You couldn't go out and do things. You couldn't hunt and you couldn't forage, but you could stay up later and you could tell stories. That's the only thing that you could do, is sit around this fire and tell stories. And then you see sort of reflections of that in mythology, like Prometheus stealing the flame for humanity. And over time, we recreate that. We sit around a TV and receive stories from the television. This source of light, a group of people around it, and stories. That's the common thread. And I think that D&D or tabletop RPGs really reflect that. You sit together in a circle and you just tell stories to one another. And I think it's such a pure expression of humanity in that sense. So I don't know. I thought it was nice that you mentioned that.
To people who ask me what D&D is, who have no concept, they've never played it before, they've only heard about it through something like Stranger Things or E.T., and they're like, oh, what is this D&D thing I keep hearing about? The easiest way to explain it I have found is like campfire stories, is sitting around and we all tell a story together and, share part of the narrative. And there are game mechanics that kind of bind, to use a pretentious word, bind the game world to make it feel, more real. And so that we're not just making up anything and everything, that there's a challenge to the story. But I think that you're absolutely right. It is, that innate need to communicate through, storytelling, whether we're making it up or whether you're running a D&D campaign that is set in some sort of Greek mythologically tied world that retells the story of Prometheus or Atlas or, whoever it happens to be. James, do you feel the same? Do you, or Potential alternative question: how do you explain what D&D is to people who have never played it before?
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly. Absolutely, there's a sort of primevalness to the act of playing D&D. I think the way I got started writing D&D kind of speaks to the way that I feel about the game, which is I left my home state of Washington and traveled to California to go to school to be an actor. And I was, by this point, completely obsessed with D&D. And it didn't help that I'd recently been horrifically burned out on third edition D&D by the player experiences. And when I was just leaving for California, the D&D Next, the playtest was in full swing. The playtest for the game that would become 5th edition. And I hung on every scrap of news and every playtest back that came out. I mean, I was thoroughly obsessed. And by this time, there was yet no Critical Role. And D&D was still, and it's weird to think about now, it was still kind of deep in the depths of uncoolness. Okay. Even Skyrim was only a couple of years old at this point. And that was like the biggest game of all time. And so, you know, going to an outskirt of LA, going to, you know, cool person, hot girl central, it was not the fresh hunting ground for D&D players that I had perhaps hoped it would be. And so for a year or more, many months, I was like, wow, I got no one to play with. I need to express myself somehow, because D&D has and continues to be for me an artistic means of expression. And when I had no ability to tell that story face to face with other people, I did what I think some of the first writers of history did, which is, well, write your stories down instead. I can only imagine the reason why the written word came into being at all is because some guy was isolated enough from other people that they could not simply sit around their campfire. They had to find a way to make it portable and give it to other people. And the exact same thing happened with me, not to be self-aggrandizing about it. Just like, God, I need some human connection. I hope someone will read this.
Yeah. And that's that's really a segue into all the other things that D&D is, because it is a vehicle for storytelling, but it's also a vehicle for just human connection. But it's also a set of rules that describes how a world works. And I know many D&D players who could care less about storytelling. They want to figure out the mechanics of the game. They want to see how it fits together, just like it was a machine and they were pulling cogs out of it. And putting cogs back. And, you know, Dael mentioned Pathfinder, either this episode or a couple episodes ago, where you're just like, nope, not going to do that. And that's a whole different aspect of D&D that makes it so wonderful, is that it's many things to many people. And you can have many different kinds of minds all sitting at the same table, getting different joys out of the same thing at the same time.
Well, that's what kind of blows my mind a little bit when you think of the history of D&D stretching back to its inception, and I suppose tabletop role-playing games in general, is the idea that it was, you know, there are trends within D&D in terms of why people play it, and that early on it was, you know, you go into the dungeon, you kill the monsters, you find the treasure, you pull them out of the dungeon, and you go into town and you sell the treasure. And it had, to my perception, I'm open to being corrected on this, but it had this almost more board gamey feel to it, where it was about the treasure and the monsters more so than necessarily like how my character feels about the monsters that they're killing. Do the monsters have homes? Do the monsters have children and, you know, like a life before I came and killed them? Which is, you know, not entirely how everybody plays it these days, but it is much, I think Critical Role maybe had a lot to do with this idea of popularizing or making D&D appeal to people that want that side of the game where it is, you know, moral quandaries, and it's more about the role play and the conversation than it is about the game mechanics. So that the game itself has kind of evolved along those lines. And yet there is a uniqueness to games, I feel this way about video games as well, in terms of an artistic medium, because the game mechanics help tell the story and capture the feel that you're going for. We've talked, Sean, you mentioned on previous episodes how horror is hard to do in D&D specifically, in 5e specifically, because the way that the mechanics of the game work set it up as a sort of power fantasy, which is very hard to capture a genuine horror vibe if the party are empowered to be able to defeat the horrific thing that confronts them. I guess jumping back over to Dael, like, what is your preferred, like, where do you sit from like pure mechanics across to like no mechanics, just storytelling on that spectrum? And maybe it's not quite a clear-cut spectrum as that, but where do you sit along there in terms of your preference, and how do you feel about the mechanics of the game's ability to tell story?
Well, I mean, like you were saying, different mechanics tell the story different ways, and you can tell the same story using a dozen different mechanics. And you know, different tabletop RPGs can emulate the same thing in different ways. You know, Pathfinder and D&D, if you look at them, let's go 4th edition and Pathfinder 1, right? Just so we get specific, like, very different mechanics. But they're both giving you a fantasy world. They just do it in different ways. It feels different. If you choose a granular magic spell casting system, it's going to feel like magic is complicated and like you need to learn it. Whereas if you choose something that is very simple, it's like you have these 3 powers and you just do them. It makes it feel like it's innate, right? So the mechanics play in a really strong way to the feel of the game. And this is the thing that I harp on my YouTube channel about all the time. I say things are vague and evocative, right? I want things to evoke certain feelings, and how are we going to make the mechanics match that? I suppose in terms of that spectrum, I think that a really good Magic the Gathering card is the perfect approach to mechanics in a tabletop RPG, if that makes any sense. So a Magic the Gathering card, for people who aren't familiar, it gives you a name and a picture that sets up this general concept of like the fantasy of it. It's like not fantasy in terms of the genre, but the thing that you want, right? What is this card doing? Someone's disappearing into a portal or something. I don't know. And then it gives you a mechanical description of what that card actually does in the game, within the game rules. What are the actual specific game rules that you are following? And then it gives you a little bit of flavor text at the bottom that wraps it all up together. And it says, this is the story of this moment. And it teaches you in that moment, in that one card, it teaches you how the mechanics are working with the story to create this moment, how these mechanics are working, how those tools, those game tools, are replicating a narrative. And it just puts it all together in this perfect little package. And I think that tabletop RPGs at their best do those things. You know, you start reading a class feature from 5th edition, and it usually starts off with one sentence describing the story of it. And then it tells you how it works, what dice you roll. You know, it uses keywords that you're familiar with from the rest of the game. But you get that one sentence telling you what the story of it is. And that's I think, where I sit. I want it to be mechanics that really serve the story. I don't necessarily need the mechanics to disappear, but they need to serve the genre, the narrative moment, the character progression that I am trying to evoke in my players.
For sure. James, do you have a similar sort of thought in terms of your approach to writing rules? Like, is there a thought process that you have in terms of like, what do I want to say here? What do I want this monster to do? What do I want this room, you know, in a dungeon to do in relation to its service of the story? How do I make that happen through the mechanics of this, you know, thing?
Yeah, this is another thing where I might draw a comparison to collectible card games like Magic or Hearthstone. It's something I learned from playing them. Excuse me. And before I played collectible card games, I had this very, very sort of story first, story only mindset where I would call it kind of the purple prose of game design, where you tell, don't show what you want your rules to do. But there is a more elegant way to do it, and it is to write rules that create a narrative that support what you want to tell people. If you have, if you've got a giant monster in a card game, for example, that loves to eat, like I don't know, like it's a gigantic Tyrannosaurus Rex that eats everything in its path. There are a lot of ways to express that in your card game. It could be, upon playing, deal 5 damage to target anything. That, and then you imagine, oh well, what it just did is it just scooped down and it ate the guy. Or it's like, I don't know, deal 2 damage to all enemy targets, or it's like destroy all enemy targets with 2 attack or less, or something like that. But it's like you get into that, you start fiddling around and playing with it, and it's like, okay, well, actually, I really want to sell the idea that this is an all-devouring creature. Because right, just straight damage could be interpreted as a lot of things. It could be charging like a bull and trampling everything in its path. If it's devouring, then there's something. How do you devour a creature? What happens when you devour a creature? It has to be smaller than you, for one thing. And so maybe that idea where it's like, okay, destroy all creatures with X attack or lower is really in there, because it can only eat things that are smaller and weaker than it. And then you get to thinking, okay, well, it's devoured it. It's kind of taken on their energy. It needs to eat to survive. So how about we say, and it gains 1 extra life for every creature it's destroyed in this way when it plays, right? Now, all of a sudden, instead of just a thing that, appears and does damage, here's our devouring monster, now you've got something that actually tells a story with the mechanics that it's brought to the table.
Yes, I think that, for me, I'm the sort of person who I don't like to describe damage as you take 5 points of damage. And I think you need to at some point, especially because, that 5 points as opposed to 8 points of damage can tell a different story in terms of, exactly what the blow was like. Although in D&D there can be, I'm thinking of, not to continue to harken on about it, but I'm thinking of that Critical Role moment where Liam's character, Vax, snuck up behind Tarry and just intended to like bock him on the back of the head and I think like stun him or paralyze him or something. And he did something like 87 damage, like something ridiculous like that. And there was a bit of disparity in terms of how Liam had interpreted the moment and what the rules kind of said should have happened with that. So there can be disparities there. But I think you're right, James, in terms of describing what the effect is first and then the kind of mechanical effect afterwards, or what the story is first and what the mechanical effect is afterwards. And when those two things come together to feel like they're describing the same thing, whether it's devouring, whether it's, you take piercing damage because it stabs you, or you take bludgeoning damage because it's a hammer that hits you, if they tell the same story, it's just mwah. And there can be a little bit of dissonance if it doesn't quite tell the same story.
And
Dissonance is the right word, right?
Yeah.
If you listen to YouTubers, you will hear the phrase, a somewhat pretentious phrase, but a useful one, of Ludo narrative dissonance, where the game, Ludo, and the story narrative do not harmonize. And so, the goal of a game designer is to minimize the dissonance and to maximize, maybe I'll coin a term here, Ludo narrative harmony.
Yeah, and to some degree, every game master, their role is to navigate this this dialogue between the rules and the story. That's what you're doing for your players. You're going, okay, well, this is what you rolled, but this is what happens.
Is this the sort of stuff, because Sean, you've touched on the fact that you teach a course around role-playing games a couple times. Is this the sort of things that you would be teaching students within that course? Is it more about mechanics or more about narrative, or about this very thing they're talking about of marrying the two together?
It's exactly what we're discussing right now. I start with games like Fate, where there is a sort of a closer connection between the rules and the narrative that comes out of it. Because in Fate, what you do is who your character is. So your character has aspects. And as you are narrating the story of what your character does, or what your character thinks, or what the game master tells what's going on, you are always looking back at these aspects of your character. And you can spend your fate points to do things when your aspect matches the situation. So I'm the third best swords person in the land. All right. That's my aspect. So if I'm in a fight, then I can say, well, since I am the third best swords person in this land, I can use my fate point to take control of the narrative a little more and probably succeed. But since I'm only the third best swords person in the land, that can also be used against me by the game master. So you're then using these a little more loose rules to pass the narrative baton, if you will, back and forth. And that's the currency of the game, are these fate points that go from the player when they use it to the game master. Then the game master uses them against the characters. And so, that's one aspect of showing how the mechanics have the output. I always say that games are machines, and you take the rules are the cogs, and you are stuffing lots of things into this machine, and you're cranking the crank, and out comes the narrative. And so we just have to look at, what is this machine? How is it built? What do we expect the inputs to be? What can we expect the outcome to be? And where is that dissonance? And where is that harmony? And, so we start with the simplest games we can find, and then we move on to more complex games to show, like with any machine, the more pieces that you add, the more chance there is that things are going to go haywire.
But I hope I have the chance to work with some of your students someday.
I want to take this class.
Yeah.
I'm teaching it next spring, so.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Just a quick trip across oceans or a country for you, James. Along that line that you were talking there or referring to there, Sean, in terms of simpler games versus games that get more mechanically complex, do you have and I'm speaking more as a fan of tabletop RPGs necessarily than a designer, do you have a preference in terms of what you prefer? Do you prefer crunchier, mechanic-heavy games, or do you prefer lighter, kind of story-driven games?
I want them all. I don't want to choose a favorite, because I want them all. I want to be able to play, I want to be able to play the game where we sit around in a half an hour, tell a complete story without too much fuss. And then I also want the game where we can really dive in and trick out the game the way we want to play it, with all these moving parts and people being ingenious with those parts.
Sure.
I love all of that.
Do you have a preference in terms of the types of stories that you like to tell? I guess, to rephrase this, it's almost like asking, what's your favorite genre of movie? Do you have particular moments that stand out to you over the times that you've been playing tabletop RPGs that you're I really enjoyed that moment, and not I want to try to recreate it, but that's that's what really speaks to me about the game. That encapsulates what I love about it, and so those are the sort of stories I want to try and tell.
I think in my younger years, it was the dramatic moments really resonated when you could hit them. But now I'm to the point where it's all about the humor. I want to laugh more, and I love the sort of playing against the expectation, and the expectation is sort of this drama that these grand stories, and I've had my fill of grand stories, I think, over the years. So I want to turn it on its ear and get some of the silliness and see some of the levity in life.
James, do you feel the same?
No, I'm not old enough yet to think that way. If you were to ask me the same question you asked Sean, I would say it's like you're asking me to choose between my favorite tool, a hammer or a screwdriver. I'm like, I need them both, man. I think where I am right now, though, is D&D is at a zenith of popularity right now, and I hope that zenith keeps getting pushed through and reaching new heights all the time. Because I think the more people I know who play D&D, the more people I will know who will have had their sort of gateway expectation filled, and I can push games like Alice is Missing onto them because I want to play those games. And I have not run with a crowd of people who are yet so exhausted of D&D. They're like, oh yeah, I'll play some other game. Hell yeah, I'll play another game. It's like most people are like, no, I know D&D and I've played it for a year and I invested all this time and effort into learning how to play. That it's like, no, let's just keep playing D&D. And like, I love D&D, so I'll never say no to that, given the right people. But I really want to play more games that don't have quite the all things for all people aspect of D&D. It's great for what it is, but it's not the every game.
Well, that's what, and maybe this is a question partly for Sean, but just because you've seen the greatest breadth of the role-playing industry from the early days of D&D to now, is I think that a lot of people have this perception, especially if you've only played 5th edition D&D, that D&D is what tabletop role-playing games are, in the same way that, like, if you've only ever eaten chocolate ice cream, you think that chocolate is the flavor of ice cream,
If you've only ever played Monopoly, that's what board games are.
Yeah,
getting some real Boss Baby vibes from this movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I consider 5th edition D&D isn't perfect in this way, especially as someone who has to tinker with it a little bit in terms of my homebrew rules. And often I'll use a lot of like the Grim Hollow rules that are in the campaign guide to make it feel more dark and scary, because 5th edition doesn't naturally lend itself to that. But is 5th edition... is its reputation for being super malleable correct, or is it just because I haven't had other flavors of ice cream?
Well, part of the I don't have a direct answer to that, because it can be, and part of the fun is making that change, right? Part of the fun is making the game your own. So, if you say that D&D is the perfect horror game, I would say it's not. But you could make it the perfect horror game for you. And part of the fun is you get to do it. You get to make it your own. So I also don't hold a lot of weight with the people that saying, well, you have to play Dread, because no, you don't.
Sure.
But if you do, great, because it is a fun game and it is fun to play. And we only have a certain amount of time in the day to do the things we want to do. So like Joey said, when I was playing AD&D back in the day, all my friends wanted to play D&D, and that was it. But there's Paranoia, and there's Call of Cthulhu, and there's I can Boot Hill, and there's all these other games, but they just wanted to play D&D. And while I was upset about that because I wanted to explore these things, I can also understand why they said that, because that's what they enjoyed. Why take the joy away from someone who's enjoying the thing that they're enjoying? Now, if they said, I hate D&D, but we're still going to keep playing D&D, then I would have had an argument to say, well, why don't we try this? So
sure.
It's personal preference and the joy of doing the thing that you love to do, even if it's not the same that thing that everyone else is doing.
Yeah, for sure. Dael, what sort of stories do you tell or do you want to tell when you're running games?
I mean, I wish that I could be more nuanced, but I'm the young Sean right now. I am a sucker. I have always been a sucker for a little bit of drama. And to this day, one of my favorite genres of television is teen drama. It's ridiculous, but I love it. It is close to my heart. And even other shows that I love Buffy. But I love that it has humor and it has some very dramatic moments, and I live for that drama. So even though I do want my games to be sort of, varied in tone, I love those dramatic moments. Someday I will be current Sean.
I feel like I'm getting to current Sean. Like, I'm a huge Batman fan. I have been since I was a little kid. But I love dark fantasy, and I love dark themes, and I love like The Dark Knight was one of my favorite movies, if nobody can tell. But I just saw the recent trailer for the Robert Pattinson movie, and I'm like, oh man, it looks good, it looks interesting. I don't want to poo on it, but it's just like, it looks like a 16-year-old saw The Dark Knight and was like, I can do better. I can make it darker. I can make it grittier. So I feel like I'm starting to get there with
See,
that.
no, I'm so excited for that one. I'm so excited for it. I'm ready for the Riddler to be scary. Give it to me. Put it in my veins.
But I've played like the Arkham games. He's already like Saw in those kind of. I mean, he's a little bit ridiculous, but they tried to set up like, what if the Riddler was Jigsaw? I feel like I've seen that already. But much like you, Dael, I think that, and I think you've said before as well, the trick to doing really good dark fantasy or really good dramatic storylines is to have that lightness in there as well, is to have, like the typical horror movie kind of makeup is the first scene is dark and gloomy and the monster gets the first person and they die in a horrific way and there's probably a jump scare. But the immediate next scene is usually daylight, and it's like the next morning after. And so it ensures that there's those peaks and valleys. But I think
light
that...
and shade.
Exactly. But I think that as all of us have said during this conversation, role-playing games are so much more than light entertainment and have the ability to express so much more than just, oh no, everything is mimics. Everything is mimics is great, but it's certainly not where I'm at in terms of constructing dungeons and the game. Having discussed why we love it, I thought we'd just quickly jump into a discussion about kind of how to get started. I mean, we know our 4 origins now in some capacity, and it sounds like each of us kind of had someone to show us the ropes. Is that... I mean, I don't want to say that's a necessity because I don't believe that it is, but is it a good way to get started if you want to break into role-playing games?
One of the talks that I attended when I was doing really, indie third-party 5e publishing stuff when I was first getting started was a talk that Chris Perkins gave at PAX back in right before Storm King's Thunder launched, so whatever year that was. And he was giving a talk on his start to D&D, and he talked about how he submitted so many things to Dragon Magazine, lying about his age to get under the submission guidelines and stuff like that. And the thing that really struck me about what Chris said was something he said at the very end, which was, and now you forget all that, because that path doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, that path may have never existed for anyone except for me. And that really resonated with me because that's true. That's truer now than it's ever been before. There is no path into tabletop RPGs. You can see it from us, and we've all had different paths into whatever little niche of the industry we're living in. Because this industry is still tiny, even though D&D is exploding, and you can fit it in a teacup. And what you have to do if you want to get into making RPGs is you got to bring your machete to the jungle and carve your own path. And you can listen to us, and you can listen to Chris Perkins, you can listen to all these people, and they can give you good ideas, important ideas that you can internalize. But these ideas need to be a structure for you, not the actual meat of what you want to do. In fact, maybe I'll say this, the number one way to find your place in tabletop role-playing games or any creative medium is to create what you want to see in the world. Create what you like. And you can never go into creative medium expecting or you can never go into a creative medium because you want attention or you want success, because that is the number one surefire way to ensure that you will be miserable. Because if you don't get success, you'll be miserable. If you do get success, you'll always be chasing a bigger high. You have to love what you love and do it for you. And if you find success and you can quit your day job, congratulations. You're very, very lucky. And I don't know, you have to be okay with that. And for some people, it takes them forever, right? Like Alan Rickman got into acting in big roles after, when he was like 40 or older. Maybe he was 50 years old, and he'd been doing this for decades and decades and decades because he loved it so much. So you just got to love it. You got to do it for you, because no one else will give you the validation that you can give yourself.
I think that's really important. Something that Sean touched on either this episode or a previous one as well, though, was the idea that when you're not working, you're generally not engaging with tabletop RPGs. You're doing, watching movies or, I don't know what Sean does, but speaking for myself, playing video games or playing board games or something like that. Because I started out I feel like there's such a, with the internet being a thing, with social media being a thing, there's such a weight on, or a perceived weight on, Gen Y and lower's shoulders in terms of turning your hobby into a profession. You've got to love what you do every day, and it needs to become a profession for you, and you start a YouTube channel and suddenly you'll be famous one day. You just got to, keep at it. And the one thing I'd just say, I absolutely love being part of the industry in whatever small way that I am, to be fair. But I started because I was running games of D&D for the love of it. Every single week, without fail, I'd run games for 2 players when not everybody could be there. I didn't care. But then I wanted to run games for more people and ended up starting a business out of that. And that's what coalesced me into the position that I'm in now. But because I was running so much D&D, it became more of a job and less of a hobby. And one little aspect of the hobby that I started pulling in as well was painting miniatures. I've mentioned before that I love wargaming, and that I had wargaming, that, I started with wargaming first. And so I've always loved the miniature side of the hobby and having big dragons and painting up the monster that the players will fight, and started offering to do commission painting for people. And when I did that, I found that as soon as I got given a miniature to commission paint, I didn't want to do it, because I was like, nah, it's too far. This is the one part of the hobby that I need for me, right? I cannot give this to the public. I cannot commodify this. I cannot turn this into another aspect of my job. And I don't want this to sound like a foreboding warning or anything like that, but I just mean to say, the more you turn something into your job, the more of a job it becomes, which is a really good thing in many ways. But you've just got to there shouldn't be a pressure to turn your hobby into a job if you just enjoy doing it. There's nothing wrong with not streaming your game of D&D or, just playing with the same group of people year in, year out and never sharing your homebrew ideas online. I think it's fantastic that the community does that. And I think it's fantastic that there's lots of resources and people like Dael out there who loves sharing their homebrew ideas, because it gives us more to draw on. But at the same time, I guess I'm just saying, don't feel a pressure to, if you just want that hobby just for yourself, it's something that you can have just for yourself. Sorry, I feel like I went on a tirade there. Dael, what's your favorite type of candy? Just to break it up a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. That? I was like, what's your favorite type of candy? Just to break it up a little bit.
Let's talk about musk sticks. I think as well, for people who are looking for how to get started to play the game, you've consumed all this stuff online, how do you actually find a group and get going? We are living in a golden age. I'm not minimizing that it can be difficult to put yourself out there, but the hardest barriers to starting to play Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop RPGs is knowing the rules. And that is easier than ever in this post sort of Zach Eubank actual play world that we live in.
Yes. Put some honor on Zach Eubank's name.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. For people who don't know, Zach Eubank basically designed the rig that allows the recording of live table sessions of tabletop RPGs. He was very clever and he put it all together and he made it work. So that's why we suddenly have such a boom in actual plays online. And there are actual plays for most games, and you can just look them up and see it played. And when you watch something played, you absorb those rules much more easily than if you're just reading a rule book. So that's your first thing, done. Second thing, where do I find people to play with? If you don't have any friends that want to play with you, you can go online, you can find a group online and you can play there. If you do have friends that you would like to play with, here's my biggest tip. Guilt them into it. For your birthday, this is what I did to get my friends to play D&D with me. For your birthday, say, all I want to do is run this tabletop RPG for you. this is all I want to do for my birthday. And they'll all go, okay. And after that, they'll have had fun. And you can link them in. You can go, let's do this again sometime. And they'll say, yes. Guilt. The power of birthday guilt.
And if you're stuck in a place that's quarantined, many conventions that used to only have games in person are now running games online, including Wizards of the Coast, which runs monthly game days where you can just sign up and you can play. And if you are new, you can say, hey, I'm new. And they have DMs specifically designed to run for new players and teach you the game. I have never seen as many schools running clubs of games now. People that I've worked with in the past are calling me up and saying, hey, you do stuff with D&D, right? And I say, yes. And they said, well, my son or my daughter, they want to learn how to play. What do I do? And so then I point them in 7 different directions and say, these are the many channels that you or your child has to get into games. Never been a better time. Just always temper your expectations because everything is going to be different. And if you have one bad session, that does not mean every session is bad. It just means it may not have been, the best venue for you. It might not have been the right group for you, but there's always another group out there that are just waiting to talk and to play.
And you know what? James's advice for getting into making these kinds of products, it applies to players as well. If you can't find the group that you want to be in, make that group. Make the thing you want to see in the world. You're never too old to get started playing. One of my favorite stories, I was on a panel at Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, for sort of beginners with D&D. And afterwards we went down and we played a couple sessions with people who watched the panel. It was, you're free to come and play and we'll teach you how to play. And I sat down at this table to be a player. And this woman sat down next to me. She was probably about 65 to 70 years old. And she sat down next to me and she said, do you think that I can start learning D&D now? Do you think I'm too old to really learn D&D now? And I said to her, Dame Judi Dench runs D&D for her grandkids. You are never too old to start playing D&D. And that woman, I explained how proficiency bonuses work to her. That was the one point of confusion, and then she got it. And she was playing a drow rogue, and immediately she was in it. She scouted ahead, saw the danger, and decided not to tell the rest of the party. She immediately understood. She's the best player I have ever seen. It was wonderful.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
She's my hero.
Well, with that heartwarming story, I think that's where we'll need to wrap it up this week. If you want to keep the conversation going, tell us why you love playing tabletop role-playing games, why you love playing D&D. What are the sort of stories you like to see and play? A funny moment that happened at one of your tables. You can keep the conversation going. Our Twitter handles are just below our names if you want to reach out to us there. Or if you're listening to this not on YouTube, you can reach out podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Send us an email. We'll read some of them out on the podcast and dissect them and discuss the different things that people email through to us. Don't forget to subscribe, whether you're on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leave us a review and just go out and pin a notice board calling for adventurers to listen to the Eldritch Lorecast, because this is the #1 D&D podcast in the world with a host of panelists like this. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Sean Merwin. See you guys next week.